About to be live. Hello, welcome back to Week in Review with the one and only Doovid. I'm your host, Jen, Church of Entropy. Happy to be here this Monday, February 27th. Whoopsie. Just trying to switch my screens here. Thanks for being with us here today on this different day. Had to switch the day up. Doovid, are you going to be sharing one of your screens there, or I'm going to pin you? Because right now we got 4. Anyway, welcome to the show. Glad to be here one day late, but still in one piece and kicking. Just had a personal conflict there that made it better to have the show today for me. So hopefully this works for everyone and isn't too much of an inconvenience for any of the regular members of the show. Thanks to everyone joining today, and looks like Doovid's just about ready to take over with what appears to be a healthy stack of links. Looking forward to seeing what you have for us this evening. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, sure. If you want to talk another minute or two, I have just a few more links. Let me organize here.
Okay, well, I've been reading it's a latter-day treatise on these finer points of sort of even hard to talk about what the paper is even about sometimes. You get so far into these things, is like, okay, I think we're talking about the same thing, but like it's really hard. So this is pretty good, in my opinion, summary of I'm not quite done, but what I've seen so far is interesting. It's like a summary of basically bringing it all together. What's happened more or less in the last 150 years in math, and more specifically the, what one would think would be a smooth transition between philosophy and, I guess, the theoretical vagaries of math. It sort of becomes like a hot potato where I guess a lot of these problems, I don't even want to call them problems, but attributes, facets, what we encounter in a lot of the philosophy is more of a like description of possibility rather than what I would think would be like if I was actually going to steel man what appears to be trying to like make philosophy scientific. There'd have to be some way to decrease the number of hypotheses. I mean, that's the whole point with science. It's the strength and the weakness of it. Strength because you can let your imagination run wild and try anything. But it's also, we all know the problems with science and restricting domains into anything. Essentially, I don't really get the sense that anyone has actually said what the problem is, because most people sort of, I hate to say it, use Gödel as an excuse to stop thinking about things. Like, oh, because Gödel has something, therefore we don't have to care about whatever anymore. I just don't really buy that Gödel's theorems are telling us much in the sense that would be relevant. So it's an interesting read, but yeah, I don't really see how any of this goes in a direction that is I mean, one would think one would eventually want to get to a conclusion. And, you know, I, yeah, I'm not really quite there yet in articulating my thoughts on this, but I'm glad to have this article that I can read through and sort of make my criticism, quote unquote, more explicit. Sort of don't like framing things as criticisms per se all the time, but like it's criticism relative to like, hey, Daryl, and hi, Wave Morpher. It's like criticism sort of relative to what it could be if my version of it was being used. So my version being it's designed to not make you happy because it's kind of like, I guess free will is a bit of like an ideal, some sense, or like anarchistic ideal. Or it's like you can't really force people to accept the views, but there is a level on which the views are just simply a repetition of physicality. So anyway, do you want to take over, Doovid, or are you still
Yeah, I'm ready. So, yeah, if you want, I could read out part of that article. You just shared that with me earlier today, but it was pretty interesting and in line with a lot of my research that I've been
it's always
sharing.
nice to like get something that's only 14 pages and it's to the point and you can tell they understand. It's really hard to listen to someone talk about math when they don't really understand it that well. Like, I don't, maybe nobody understands math that well, but you know.
Yeah, I'm not so clear because the last like month I covered a lot about Descartes, um, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Leibniz, the verse canonization process of modern mathematics, the scientific method, Bacon, the founding of the Royal Society. And then last week, I started moving into um, Helmholtz and the creation of modern physics. And, so that was pretty interesting. And I'm going to get into Hilbert. And I was watching Esoterica, the channel, and he had a guest on talking about tips and techniques for learning ancient languages with this guy, Polymathy Luke, who I guess has popular lectures on learning ancient languages, mostly Greek and Latin. And one of the things I hadn't mentioned the last few weeks was about the role that Latin and Greek had played in um, the formulation of science. And around the time of Riemann and the second formulation that I was talking about last week with the conservation of energy of Helmholtz and Maxwell and others, was the falling away from scientific works being published in Latin. Till then, almost all scientific work was published in Latin. And part of it, what I'm going to go more into this week, I talked about the Marburgians. And here was a quote I put in the chat I like from last week as Herman Cohn, a half Galician. Thanks for tuning in. Herman Cohn, who um, had actually trained to be a rabbi and was a physicist, but went back to teaching at like a Jewish rabbinic school. Um, Galileo said the book of nature is written in math. So Cohn's adaptation, the book of nature, is written in sentences, with math as its letters, and a priori principles of pure knowledge as its syntax. And I was talking about the Neo-Kantians, and we might talk more about the Neo-Kantians in terms of the second, what I'll call the scientific revolution, canonization that happened with the conservation of energy. And Hilbert is after that, after the canonization of the conservation of energy, um, which somewhat also unifies the advancements in calculus, mainly like Laplacians and eigenvectors. So the Newtonian basic calculus that they had worked out into vector fields and the Laplacian operators that were necessary for Maxwell's equation, and also for the modern working of practical mechanics, physics in 3 dimensions, and thermodynamics, that they all basically operate with the same vector calculus and Laplacians and eigenvectors. Um, the Einsteinian revolution isn't really a unification. It's more like a breaking away from the unification that had happened before. And a lot of it is related to the philosophy of mathematics. So let me share some links. So Claire Call was on um, Sula that I set him up with that, and I mean, not sure it was that interesting. I was mentioning in the chat, I think Jennifer quoted something that I had called Claire's kind of philo-Semitism bordering on anti-Semitism. That is,
There's something like pushy about it, where she's like, no, you don't feel like that. You're not a proper Jew. You know what I mean? That's what you're thinking of, right?
well, I know a lot of what that means. That, as I was mentioning, it's more common among the Far East and Chinese philo-Semitism that you has a mirror of it. But if people follow that, they could check that content out. Um, this wasn't that interesting actually, but it was the Icon School of Medicine talking about psychedelics, preclinical models of mechanisms of action. I mean, only somewhat relating to the heart problem of consciousness and like Libet and um, how neurotransmitters and various things. I mean, somewhat interesting, so I thought I'd share that. Um, Stephen Robson, the Bergson follower, made a video on Chat GPT, and unfortunately, I didn't find that this one that insightful either. He kind of talked about Chat GPT and certain problems with it, and
Problems with emulating consciousness.
yeah, but he focused on like some of these like problems that he would call moral reasoning or encoding certain things where it would appear that they've encoded basically like a hard rule not to use racial slurs. So in the case of like the trolley problem, someone had posed like a bug in the system where like if you could you like stop a train from, God forbid, killing a bunch of people, but the only way to do it was to say a racial epithet. And the current Chat GPT, when it was done, had put in their system that like under no circumstance is it acceptable to say a racial epithet, even if it was to save lives. And then it was modified, and that probably would have been a hard written hand code. Um, and I think it was a more on Chat GPT. But if people follow Robbins, it's a little bit interesting. Here was Medcram, which I've shared quite a bit in the past. The kind of like training videos for medical students, doctors, and it was just a quick, what happened to monkeypox, and we didn't talk about monkeypox that much, but it was big in the news. There were a significant amount of cases, and it's kind of disappeared. And his prognosis was one thing: they had targeted vaccinations to, God forbid, possibly the homosexual community, where it was breaking out, and it was unclear if it was sexually transmitted because it was transmitted by skin and there were lesions all over the body. But the presenter's conclusion was more just being careful because unlike COVID-19 that has um, I forget the technical term, but it'd be transmitted without the people knowing they're transmitting it. Monkeypox was somewhat obvious that the people who had it had these like lesions, And for a while, there were like videos on the internet of like people going to the gym with lesions and getting shamed, or like people being caught in public with obvious monkeypox lesions. So it thought just the public education about monkeypox was enough to, but it didn't disappear. Monkeypox is still around in low numbers, but just thought the public education about monkeypox and the fact that it's somewhat obvious it's not like COVID-19 that could be transmitted, in the air or through snot. It's transmitted by long extended skin on skin um, touching, and when the people have monkeypox, it's usually obvious that they have pretty nasty lesions. But I'm not sure if you noticed that it kind of died from the news cycle, and or if you were following that much. So
Not particularly, no.
okay, so I just thought I'd share that because it was a pretty big news story, and kind of disappeared. Um, Justin Riddle from the Science of Consciousness conference, a disciple of Hamarov, had interview with Kelvin McQueen. I think I've shared Kelvin McQueen, and he's doing his interviews interplayed with PowerPoints. So I'm not sure I like that strategy. I mean, it's a little bit interesting, but he'll have a little bit of the interview, and then he would recorded, and then I'll put like PowerPoint explanations about topics within the video. But it's keeping up there with uh, Calvin McQueen on the collapse of the wave function consciousness as the collapse of the wave function. Um, Here's another cold fusion that's been making a bunch of these chat GPT videos, and it's similar to the Robbins line of failures of moral reasoning within chat GPT and political bias. So I'm not sure how serious that problem will be, or if they'll program around. But a lot of controversy now is trying to figure out chat GPT's ability to morally reason, or if it has a political bias.
It's so interesting how much this technology just reflects our, I don't know, subconscious in some way. Everybody kind of sees what they're already looking at when they think about ChatGPT.
Okay, I guess Jennifer's been watching The Crucible more than I have, but they had another.
Well, sorry for liking debates, even though the channel owner's a dick.
Okay, well, he was on Week in Review, but
He was on Week in Review?
you remember Andrew came on Week in Review and talked about his
No.
history of Brittany and Politically Provoked?
Sorry, slipped my mind.
Are you remembering now, or it still slipped your mind?
Yeah, it's not coming back.
Um, yeah, so Jennifer mentioned something about the I guess the farmer kept on using the word arbitrary in response to I guess like studies, or I wasn't following it that much, but she mentioned the etymology of the word arbitrary, and I thought that was interesting because it's also related to science, that equations and units are referred to as arbitrary. So arbitrary comes from the Latin word of judge, like in today, an arbiter or arbitration are regular words in like my mom. um, Construction arbitration would mean um, like a legal panel, as opposed to taking it to the U.S. Court system. You could take it to an arbitration panel, and or arbitration used sometimes as appearing before a judge who, or a panel that will um, decide on a certain issue. and the word comes from judge. And so it's interesting, the current uses of the word arbitrary, usually as an adjective here, and they said deciding by one's own discretion, depending on one's judgment. Um, so I would say most often today, arbitrary means, people mean basically random. Like, oh, that's arbitrary, meaning like there's no rhyme or rhythm to it. It's just kind of random. Um, I don't know, even people may even mean something like meaningless by it. And in science also, there's, but it comes from the word judge, and would be arbitrary in terms of like discretionary power, where the judge made a decision and it's arbitrary, meaning it's like that because the judge said so. You don't necessarily get to know the reason or logic of it. Uh, Maybe now connected to the usage in terms of random, because it's discretionary, though. The judge has discretionary power and they decided so. So that's why it is. And then in science, you have arbitrary equations or arbitrary unit, which, so historically, units were related to body sizes, or things in nature, like the size of grapes or eggs, biblical measurements, and they're not standardized because they're based on body sizes, and people have different body sizes. And as we've been talking about, maybe we'll talk more this week in the coming weeks about the canonization of science and the canonization of units. But in science, sometimes you have an arbitrary equation or an arbitrary unit that would just be like a temporary placeholder to show the ratio between two substances or intensities, quantities, and usually in relation to something that's of an unknown unit. So you need a temporary placeholder, and that would be considered an arbitrary unit. So I'm not sure if you had anything else. I mean, you're the one who brought up wanting to talk about
Well, I'm just
arbitrary.
thinking the definition of arbitrary may have changed because arbiter is not a very common concept. I mean, who is referred to as an arbiter anyway?
Well, you don't refer to judge judges.
My suggestion is that people used to be referred to as arbiters and aren't anymore. But the word arbitrary is still there. So I think it's become unmoored from its original intention because its original intention doesn't exist anymore, kind of, is what I was alluding to. So I was just interested to kind of like maybe do a historical kind of study of the term etymology, I guess.
Yes, but the word arbitration is still semi-popular, and
Are the people
um,
that do arbitration called arbiters, though?
I'm not even sure if they would refer to the people who do arbitration as arbiters anymore. Um, but arbitration is still a common word in law. That like, okay, me and Jennifer, God forbid, have a dispute that we just can't resolve, especially if it involves money, and therefore have to go through arbitration, which would mean um, a non-governmental remedy to our dispute. And so this, like, I know the word because my mom's a lawyer, and so arbitration would be like, okay, so God forbid, let's say me and Jennifer are making a big money off of our streaming, and there's some sort of dispute, and it involves money, and we disagree about who the money goes, how much, how the money should be split, and we're threatening to sue each other, and instead of taking it to court, we agree to arbitration. And arbitration would be legally binding, but it'd be an independent, non-governmental legal body that would decide it, and most of the time it's just one single judge, and sometimes it's advisory. Um, you could compare it to like marriage counseling, where the same word counsel is related to the legal profession, like marriage counseling in the psychiatric profession. Um, but if it was like divorce, it could be arbitration because there's going to be some sort of legality that will be decided, usually financial. And so arbitration still a pretty common word in the U.S. because it's frequently used in business. But maybe probably the type word that if you saw a lawyer and your lawyer recommended like arbitration, even if the person was like educated, you'd be like, well, what's that? Um, in chess, sometimes tournament directors are referred to arbiters.
Binding arbitration still has the original sense of the term.
Yes, that's why my point is the word still exists, but it's a technical word in the legal system. And I'm not sure if it's the United States. It could be in Europe. Chess tournament directors are referred to as arbiters.
That
Which
would make sense, like some sort of competition. I guess I'm thinking of it like two guys jousting type deal, having an arbiter, basically like a what are they called in the sort of impartial person in a sports game?
the referee.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so in chess, you usually a word director, but occasionally, maybe in Europe, they use the word arbiter as opposed to like you don't have a referee in chess, you have an arbiter that would arbitrate resolve disputes. So if the two players had a dispute and needed to take it up with the arbiter, and then the arbiter would resolve the dispute. Um, but I don't think that's what the man meant by arbitrary. When he meant arbitrary, I think he meant largely random.
Well, it's sort of an interesting case study of the evolution of the meaning of a word, because what I would think that it meant would be that the person is acting over, the individual is acting as an arbiter of the definition, and thereby allowing anybody to make their own definition, and thereby randomizing the concept of definition to pure chaos.
Well, it relates what I would say your critique of the Western science canonization process. We say, okay, well, Newton rose to become head of the Royal Society and canonized him. There was a body, board of directors, maybe voting, standardization committees. Um, but someone had, or a body had discretionary authority to make a ruling, and that was an arbitration. And to everybody else, he would say, well, that's arbitrary. Meaning to say that when we were arguing the last few weeks, God forbid, like Renault or like Jennifer, and let's say her um, criticism or desire not to be bound by a canonized Western system. So he's saying, well, that's arbitrary. Like,
That's
well, what?
really not what I said per se, but okay.
But he's saying, like, well, what do I care about uh, Bertrand Russell? And he's like, that's just arbitrary. But arbitrary in the sense it's not just random. It's not like, oh, Jennifer's talking about panpsychism, so Doooovid mentions Bertrand Russell. It's not random in the sense where it's just someone who said
Did I
something.
actually say that though? Did I say that Bertrand Russell was arbitrary?
No, you didn't, but I'm giving an example of how it's related. Because Bertrand Russell is like an authority with discretionary power. Why does Jennifer have to state her ideas within the confines of the lexicon that was created by Bertrand Russell and say, well, because it's arbitrary and
That would be
arbitrary.
that would be like calling Noam Chomsky a conspiracy theorist. The absolute worst way to portray it, because you're using you're using a historical definition when the definitions change. The exact word not to use, because it's
Well,
not arbitrary. because it's what happened throughout the evolution of Western civilization. That's not
Well, I'm saying
arbitrary.
it's arbitrary because he has authority to make discretional. He's a judge who had the authority, discretional authority to make rulings that other people have to abide to. So me and Jennifer have to abide
So you're
to the
saying
judgment.
Russell was the arbiter.
Yeah, so what he says on panpsychism is classically, I'm saying it's arbitrary because as a
Not
judge,
in the conventional sense of the term. So here we have Doovid using
no, I'm saying the
an
conventional meaning.
anti-conventional sense of a term, which happens to maybe be literally right under a wide interpretation.
Well, no, I think I'm using the conventional sense, meaning the how
I'm
the word
sorry,
would
the
have been.
conventional sense of arbitrary is random.
Well, I mean conventional meaning like appealing to tradition and how that it
So
was used.
not conventional, the traditional definition, whether I mean, it may or may not be. They may or may not line up.
Yes, I mean the traditional arbitrary means that there was a person in a position of authority that had discretionary authority. And the reason it is that way is because the authority figure, the judge, said so. And therefore it's arbitrary because you don't necessarily know the reason. Jennifer's like, well, why do I have to follow what Bertrand Russell said? It's like, because he's the judge. It's arbitrary. And so that could be the modern usage of like postmodernism and anti-authoritarianism to say, well, arbitrary, which used to mean you had to follow it because the judge said so, now just means random. So arbitrary historically had the meaning, well, it's kind of random, but you have to do it because the judge said so, to now arbitrary just means random. Although even in the sense that the Farmer was using in the Crucible debate when he said it was arbitrary, really he did mean in the traditional sense that he mean, well, the study was funded by the Gates Foundation or elites, and it's not accurate, it's just arbitrary. So when the guy Avi or the other person kept on quoting studies, he said, well, those are arbitrary. Those just because elites have power and they have the discretion to so you could argue that the farmer was actually using arbitrary in the traditional sense, not meaning random, but meaning, I mean, he semi meant random because he thought what the studies were saying wasn't true, but he's saying it's
They
arbitrary
didn't
because
even, I mean, the arbitrary bit in that was when it was starting to fall apart, and he's like, well, define arbitrary. I don't think they actually got anywhere in terms of a definition. Like going to this. I mean, when people say that's arbitrary, it just sounds like the accusation that they're making is that it's something the person made up. So, like, if someone was like saying, a bunch of Indians talked about high birth and low birth, one might be inclined to think it's just something they made up, something like that. God forbid.
yeah, but that's my point that arbitrary means something the judge made up. It's not something just someone
When
made up.
someone says that's arbitrary, the denotation or whatever the suggested meaning, in my opinion, is that they're saying you're acting as the arbiter, and your opinion is not justified or not authoritative. That's what they're saying.
That could be modern common usage, but I would say that the traditional historical arbitrary meant that it was something made up by an authority figure. So there's a difference between if just someone makes it up and an authority figure makes it up. It's only um, arbitrary when an authority figure makes it up. And in our postmodern world, um,
Authority
now
itself is
arbitrary just
ridicule.
yeah. I mean, so our use of arbitrary is a way of ridiculing historical aristocracy. So that would be my like John McWhorter um, societal evolution analysis of why arbitrary means random today. It's purposely flipping the definition in order to ridicule the European feudal caste type system where the word arose from.
So I think it's a
In
good
words,
example.
say like Jennifer can't say something arbitrary because she's not.
Here's the thing.
In the old school system, Jennifer's power level is not high enough to actually say something arbitrary.
I'm not allowed to arbitrate. Unfortunately, the concept of arbitration has been erased, and therefore I'm right back to being able to arbitrate again.
Well, so the use of the modern usage purposely is something probably in the United States meant to ridicule the old world European aristocracy. To say like, well, we're no longer under the authority of the crown and of the European aristocracy, and now anybody could arbitrate, and therefore it's just randomness. And that's, the US, probably the US system, maybe also related to the US system of trial by jury, as opposed to trial by judge, trial by an elite. It became trial by jury of your peers, in the sense that anybody could actually arbitrate, where historically, when the word was in usage, um, arbitrary assumed someone who took high birth, because only someone who took high birth could arbitrate. Okay, so
Yeah. So very interesting digression, and just to sort of round this off, not all words can evolve. Like a chair basically doesn't evolve at all as a concept. It has a fuzzy boundary because like there's some stuff like, oh, okay, maybe only 40% of people recognize that thing as a chair, right? Because that's what a fuzzy boundary means in the technical sense. It's not, oh, our idea of a chair evolved. That is also technically true, but it's so barely true that it's like that's not the good way to look at it, because the scale in which a chair is changing is like the scale in which a planet is changing. But it's not so with words like arbitrary, because we're talking what, I forget where it came from. Let's say 500 years. There's demonstrable difference in the sense of this term. So it's not anything like chair. It's something that can actually change demonstrably so within, frankly, not that much time. So anyway, that's all I want to say on that. You want to finish your what looked like maybe 20, 23 tabs?
yeah, I actually still have a whole bunch more. So let me just read this quote. This is regarding to Maxwell, um, and his, what they call, analogy agenda, and the role of analogy in science. Um, we must therefore discover some method of investigation which allows the mind at every step to lay hold of a clear physical conception without being committed to any theory founded on the physical science from which that conception is borrowed, in order to obtain physical ideas. Without adopting a physical theory, we must make ourselves familiar with the existence of physical analogies. By physical analogy, I mean the partial similarity between the
You're
laws.
not like screen sharing what you're talking about, eh?
I am screen sharing. I took this from an article and I just messaged you on Facebook.
Oh,
So I'm
okay,
reading
because you're
from the
screen
Facebook.
sharing Facebook right now.
Yeah, I'm reading just the Facebook message to you,
Okay.
because that's where I have this. By physical analogy, I mean the partial similarity between the laws of one science and those of another, which make each of them illustrate the other. Humanists may argue among themselves over the epistemological and metaphysical status of science, but the scientists, even when they have philosophers' doubts about the final truth of their conclusions, seem to go about their business as if all of those issues were totally besides the point, anyways. And if you should have the terribly poor fortune of being a philosopher yourself, you certainly don't want to hear what it is that the working scientists themselves have to say about you and your subject. The goal of physics became the successful formula to be checked by experiment, or an absence of a good formula, a fiendishly clever and unexpectedly experimental result, suggestively defiant of likely future formulas. Maxwell's formulas were needed, his methods weren't. So I have more stuff on this topic, but it's going to relate to the role of mathematics and somewhat the decline of Latin. So when Descartes it was mostly explanations, and even Newton, was still creating the calculus, and he had a lot of explanation. And the precursor to do science and why you had to take high birth was because of the language barrier of Latin. That science was exclusively done in Latin, and if you wanted access to what philosophers, medicine, law, science, you had to read in Latin, and if you wanted to be published, you had to publish in Latin, and that really didn't change until the mid 1800s. Um, but you start having by towards the end of the 17th century a codified calculus and mathematics where the Latin becomes kind of unnecessary because science is now codified in um, mathematical formulation. As I
Logic.
said, really, well, no, it's not logic.
You could perhaps call it mathematical logic.
No, you can't. I mean, logic. I mean, it's in
All
the
right,
article
fine.
you talked about. I mean, logic and mathematics are not are two separate fields that are still debated whether mathematics and logic um, are even connected. So I would say it's more calculus, and whether calculus is logical or not is debatable even till today. But about the 1850s, you have
Hold on a minute. No one debates whether calculus is logical.
well, yes, they do. I mean, that's the part of the
Mathematics is presupposed to be logical on the
No, it's
basis
not.
of it working.
It's not. I mean, saying like maybe you just haven't studied it. There's no. I mean, that's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But even prior attempts, it's even in the article that you formulated that Hilbert, that it's a dispute among philosophers and mathematicians whether mathematics is logical. I mean, you put that. I mean, I'll get to it when the article that you just shared earlier talks about
I
this.
said calculus is logical. I did not say mathematics was.
But even calculus, I mean, that whether calculus is logical or not is unclear.
Well, it's a bunch of rules. It's just hard to see how it wouldn't be definitionally, but whatever.
You'd have to define what you mean by logic, but saying it
I
doesn't
don't
follow.
need to define anything. I can just look at what's there and say, does it meet an existing definition? Answer yes. And I would be the first to say, yeah, math. I wouldn't grant that math is necessarily logical. Like, I don't think that makes sense. But calculus is a method.
But I mean, it defies logic, and saying
How?
to the simple mind that you say, well, it's just like symbols and stuff that they don't understand, so that they're one and the same. Um, but what exactly calculus is it propositional?
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking
Does
about
it have self
differential and integral.
contradictions?
I'm talking about differential and integral calculus that comes out of limits.
Well, even if you take the formula, like the derivative of x of f of x and the f of x in the f of x minus h, or the fundamental formula of calculus, to say that that statement is logical is not clear. Or when you take the field of logic is different. So you could argue whether calculus is logical, but they're different fields. And we might get too diverged from the topic to come back to it, because I actually have material on this to share. Uh, but science becomes codified in differential equations, and differential equations doesn't really get codified until the 1850s with the Laplacians and eigenvectors that when Maxwell eventually has his formulation of the Maxwell's equations, still till today, that's basically the canonized form of all science, that it has to be formulaic in terms of differential equations. in that sense that Maxwell had a whole bunch of analogies trying to describe electromagnetism, and he wrote a bunch of papers. He's not remembered for his analogies; he's remembered for his formulas. And like to these days, um, I don't know everybody because you don't really get to Maxwell's equations till like calculus 3, um, and even in physics that yeah, I don't know how many people even gets to Maxwell's equations. I wouldn't be surprised if less than like 3% of college graduates even learn Maxwell's equations. Um, educated people like obviously my mom who didn't even get past algebra, knows Maxwell's and probably heard of Maxwell's equation. But it's saying like people learn Maxwell's equations, they they're not familiar with his analogies and which was his method. How did he come up with this stuff? But it doesn't matter how he came up with it because eventually he came up with a formula, and now we have the formula, and the formula is what's important. And so the codification of science is within the calculus, and so that was the quote. So let me share a few more things. I could read from articles if people want to get more in depth on it. So here I talked a lot last week about um, the neo-Kantians. So here is Ernst Cassier's The Philosophy of Symbolic Form. And, Cassier is from the last neo-Kantians who, neo-Kantianism kind of dies out with World War II because unlike um, the Frankfurt School that relocates to America and becomes popularized in America, the Marburg School basically dies out in the war. Although there's been an attempt to um, revitalize neo-Kantianism in the Marburg School. I talked a lot last week about Cohn and a little bit about Marburg. So Marburg's famous book on the philosophy of symbolic form, and he also has a famous book on determinism and indeterminism. Um, but for science and even the question like math, the creation of this symbolic form that science is done within a symbolic form. And last week we were arguing about like why I kind of see as Jennifer's unnecessary insistence on being a scientist
I'm not
or
even saying I'm a scientist. I'm saying that the teachings are scientific. And I'm not the first person to say this. Okay. I would be the first person to deny it.
well, yeah, I mean it's almost meaningless when you say that. So and so
Well,
I
like,
claimed last week that
one might say that that applies more accurately to what you're calling science than what I'm calling science.
yeah, I mean, so science in terms of experiments and formulas. And so I was saying that space and time are not part of science, they're part of philosophy. And you could even argue that number is part of philosophy, and then the language of science, meaning mathematics and the calculus. But this was heavily discussed by the neo-Kantians. This is a whole 500-page book, written, I think, like 1921. So
It's just sort of like if you're saying space and time are philosophical, you're kind of going up against science definitions, which normally people think of as like space and time being pretty important to science. Like my research indicates space and time are even more important to science than we thought.
um, well, it's important to separate that they're not part of science. They're part of the language and lexicon, but they're not defined within science. They're defined by philosophy. So if you have seconds or meters, that those are just symbolic language that science uses but doesn't define. And then if it
Okay,
does
so what
decline,
you're saying is that they are primitives.
well, I'm going to get to that. Like when I talk about whole question of grounding and primitives. But if anyone's more academic in the chat and they want to read Cassier's famous philosophy of symbolic form, and Cassier is like a contemporary of Einstein, and I just read his book this week on Einstein also. I think I shared this book also. It turns out it was 3 volumes, so I had a hard time locating um, volume one from Lang, another famous neo-Kantian, on um, the history of materialism. So this goes into the first volume by Frederick Albert Lang, and he was at Marburg. So like Lang and Cohn are the main original neo-Kantians from Marburg, which is a university, and it covers up until Kant. Or this actually, volume one covers up until Newton and Leibniz, but covers the ancient period. Um, Here was also something interesting. This is a PhD thesis. Um, Bottle Physics and the Making of Modern Science in Colonial India. And I guess he studied in America, Minnesota, and Arkansas. Uh, and the PhD thesis was actually University of British Columbia, Vancouver, in Canada, and talks about Indian physics and has a little history of pre-Western Indian physics, the Westernization of Indian physics, and then the contributions to the Einsteinian era of Indian physicists, such as um, Satyendra Bose, um, Chandra Shekhar Vikantaraman, Meghnad Saha, um, and even includes like letters that Einstein. So people who know science, um, history, just a Western, know that Einstein had correspondence in with Indian scientists. There's a few parts of quantum theory discoveries that were made by Indian scientists in India. So if you looked at, as say, like the canonization, the first canonization that happened with Newton in the Royal Society of London, and then the second canonization with the conservation of energy with the Helmholtz and Maxwell, and then the rise of quantum theory. So the first two parts happened almost exclusively in Europe, was, to some extent just a handful of blue-eyed men. By the time you get to quantum theory,
Uh, I guess people like are triggered by the blue eye thing. You're not gonna drop it. You're just gonna pepper it into the conversation endlessly.
um, that's how I say it. So I mean, people are triggered. I mean, if they just every time I get triggered, I say that they get triggered. Uh, but Einstein and the quantum theory is already global. That whether Newton took certain things from ancient cultures or came from the East, what happened at the Royal Society of London, and even in the second era of the late 1800s, is almost exclusively based on research and technology of Europeans, of British, French, German. Um, Quantum theory is not that way, and there's known contributions uh, globally, including from India. So I just shared that this was an interesting PhD thesis talking about Indian physics. Okay, so here's Rick Beato. He was talking about Duran Duran, perfect song, Come On Done. And I almost thought about trying to do um, these songs for week in review a while ago, and I think I just forgot about. I didn't do Duran Duran these songs, did I? Think I forgot about it, and so Rick Beato released a video this week claiming that Duran Duran's "Ordinary World" was almost a perfect song. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Duran Duran. They were around a long time. Duran Duran was formed in the 70s. They were like an 80s band that had you semi well known like the second British wave of invasion, but they became most popular in the 90s with their where they kind of rebranded themselves as alternative music and released the self-titled Duran Duran album that was called the Wedding Album and had two major hits, Come On Done and Ordinary World. So I don't know if you're familiar with these songs or Duran Duran as
I've
a
definitely
band.
heard Duran Duran songs. I think that they made a song for American Psycho, possibly. These names don't really ring a bell though. Maybe Ordinary World, actually, come to think of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it has a list of they're pretty popular songs. I would assume you've heard both of them, and they're kind of simple songs. So people watch Rick Beato, see this week. I couldn't find the sheet music on it, um, so Rick Beato had the sheet music on on his video. Came in from a rainy Thursday on the avenue. Thought I heard you talking softly. I turned the lights, the TV, and the radio. Still, I can't escape the ghost of you. I'm probably off in my key there. Sorry about that. What has happened to it all? Crazy, some say. Where is the life that I recognized? Gone away. The chorus is what you probably recognize. But I won't cry for yesterday. There's an ordinary world. Somehow I have to find. And as I try to make my way to the ordinary world, I will learn to survive. It's actually Duran Duran's got very difficult to match that guy's voice. Not just like high pitched, kind of like natural falsetto. Does that song sound familiar to you?
Not quite, no. I'm not a big music buff though, so
Yeah, 1993. I remember the song when I was young. It was like MTV videos. They Duran Duran like had a lot of MTV videos, and it was on MTV constantly. I'm not even sure if I had some sort of like deep thought on it. They had another song, "Come On Done," which was actually more popular than Ordinary World, and this was more toony. So it's ironic that Rick Beato called um, Ordinary World a perfect song. The Come On Done was definitely more popular, and he kind of has like a talking, like he opens up its own like a talk sing that's hard to mimic, and it has a woman in the background, like the old video. She's like underwater in chains. Come On Done. Can't even keep from falling apart at the seams. Um, we'll try to stay blind. Hey, child, stay wilder than the wind. Who do you need? Who do you love when you come undone? So yeah, I'm not going to be. Doovid's not doesn't have it in me to do grand Duran Duran karaoke, but whatever reason I had those songs in my head this week. So I had quite a few articles on. So I'm not sure what type of week in review you had or what you wanted to share. I did edit my essay a little
To
bit,
be
but
honest, I've been working on story building. So most of what I have are just like pages of perhaps not quite sensical various like yeah, they're not really ready to like present yet, but I'm getting it feels like I'm getting closer, so it's not too frustrating. But yeah, I don't have too much to share this week because I just been too much involved in the process of to get something like finished enough. There you go.
um, yeah, so maybe it's easier if you ramble on that after I sign off. So I did have quite a bit of continued research on various topics, mostly about the energy and Maxwell. I talked last week about Helmholtz, so I had more stuff this week on Maxwell, and I also had okay, just to show that. So Jennifer had claimed,
Uh-oh. I can tell
falsely claimed,
this isn't going anywhere good for me.
Jennifer had falsely claimed that something like the reason she can't publish is because like no, they would never accept some
That
sort of
is
like.
literally not what I said. I said it was my own opinion that it wasn't worth trying to adapt what I was saying for peer review due to prejudging their metaphysical rigidity to be in excess of what my teachings necessitate.
Yeah, so it's kind of nonsensical, and if you're walking back what you said,
I don't know what you're talking about and continuously trying to straw person what I say into that so it's easier to attack, but please go ahead and say what's wrong with what I said after all.
well, I mean, you made some claims that like you can't find a single paper of that on science
And
that
did you find one? Didn't think so. I mean, I mentioned the cause of this earlier, and is
well, yeah, I
because
mean, one thing, but
physics
like
and
Karl Popper
philosophy are
is
kind of deadlocked in a manner that makes progress difficult without it. It's hard to progress with any level of certainty.
well, because scientific papers are formulas. So I mean, if you like a paper on science that's not just like a bunch of formulas, is philosophy. But I mean, really, even Karl Popper says talks about what you talk about with the problems of the Cartesian assumptions and um, the nature of philosophical problems and their root in science. But here was just a, I mean, I could go through, but yeah, other stuff to look at. But
It's
you
fine. I mean, it's all
just
good.
just a
It'll
Google
probably help
Scholar search
understanding.
on metaphysics and Cartesian,
Yeah.
and I mean, there's thousands of articles, and I mean, here you have one, the
And what
limits
about
of
any metaphysics that isn't defined entirely in an Aristotelian paradigm? Or that even understands the problems with, like, there's
we
still
have one
people.
critiquing and
Anyway.
I mean, you're just on the first page, mind-body union and the limits of Cartesian metaphysics. But yeah, I
Okay.
would say that
And is
probably
that
like
peer reviewed? And if so, in what department or what organization peer reviewed it, or however it works?
here is there a problem with Cartesian interaction, um, the breakdown of Cartesian metaphysics. Published in the Review of Metaphysics. But here's Dewey, Heidegger, and the Challenge to Cartesian Metaphysics. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of challenges to the decline of Cartesianism and mechanism, the Leibnizian Cartesian debates.
In what faculty? I'm sure the philosophy faculty was talked. I mean, I'd be shocked if it wasn't talked about at all, ever. I'm talking about in science as a pretext for switching into a non-Cartesian mathematical
Well, that would intrinsically be
realism.
philosophy. Like,
It
if you're
wouldn't
talking,
be. That's the thing. Like peer review. Okay, so you're saying I got to pass philosophy peer review now, an even more ridiculous aim, as I have no scholastic background in philosophy at all. In fact, I went into physics to avoid, I'm sure ironically to some people, the vagaries of philosophy.
I mean, your assumptions are basically nonsensical because they
Trivial and arbitrary.
they demonstrate a lack of knowledge about the process. So if you say you're scared of rejection, you're scared of criticism, and therefore you don't want to publish, but saying you publish and it gets reviewed. The review could be positive or negative, but I mean, you don't like peer review is not something you pass or fail. You publish, you could self-publish, and if someone reviews it, it's peer reviewed, even if it's a negative review. And then if you get published in a journal,
Yes. What type of journal would have me?
conceivably any of them, if you submit
Well,
to
what
them,
are
if you
these
meet
journals? These ones you just pulled up here, what are they published in?
various
Okay,
publishers. I mean,
give an example then.
um, Food and Journal of the Humanities and Social Science, Journal of the History of Philosophy.
Hold on a minute. Did you say food?
Fudon, Fudon.
Okay.
The Handbook of Contemporary Animism, Journal Continental Philosophy Review, Studies in the History of Philosophy of Science, Taylor
Okay, so
Francis.
I'm not presenting continental philosophy, so I can't go into continental philosophy review.
Yeah, I'm saying your excuses are worthless.
Well, first of all, publishing in philosophy is pretty
If you
worthless.
just say
If
you're
what I'm
scared of
talking about is physics.
rejection, you're
No,
scared of rejection, you're scared of criticism. I
that's
mean,
not what I'm saying.
your excuses are nonsensical.
Sure, keep telling yourself that.
Well, I'm telling you that.
No, you think that your ramblings can change my empirical facts. They can't.
I don't think you have. I mean, when with this, I don't think you have material facts.
Why would anyone? The question is, what's expedient? And the answer is get the information out physics wise, any way possible, so that people can do physics better. Peer reviewing it in philosophy, it's going to get read by who knows how many people and influence even less Why would I do that? It doesn't
But
help my mission,
your knowledge of process and procedure is quite lacking. And
clearly, as I
so,
never
and
had any intention of, like, I'm aware of processes and procedures, just not in this orthodoxy.
I mean, these days, if you actually had something, you would be more likely to patent it than publish it. So if you had something philosophical, you publish it. If you had something in science, it would likely be patented, not published. And
Unless I wanted people to know that I didn't care about money.
yeah, so if you had something, you could publish it. There's nothing stopping you from publishing it.
Unless there's an impossible barrier to entry to publishing based on a pre-existing metaphysical perspective of materialist reductionism.
Yes, I would say that's just in your head. It's not there.
Oh, the materialist reductionism is just like my opinion, bro, type deal. All right.
But it's not a barrier to publishing. And it might be consensus. You might be ridiculed if someone read it. They might critique you. You might be ignored, but it's not an actual barrier to publishing. If you submitted it to a journal that had a bent in an opposite direction, they might not publish your paper in their journal, but it's not a barrier of entry to you publishing or peer review.
Well, if there's no journal to publish it, there might be a problem. Like, if you were actually serious, you'd come to me with a journal already. But you're not. You're just bancing.
We get in this like pointless circular argument that you're just saying that because I don't care whether you publish or not. I'm just saying that whatever you're stating about the nature of publishing is inaccurate. So
Okay, your opinion is that my opinion is inaccurate. Fine, that's cool. We're entitled, free to disagree.
You have your own reasons. I mean, like that you're not writing anything, that you're not publishing anything. Fine, doesn't matter to me. So I'm just making the point on the process and procedure. And so, if you want to frame your reasons in terms of like, because you're claiming the process and procedure is the way that it's not, but it's just going to be a pointless argument. So I did Google Scholar look at some of that and there, but I didn't have too much time to read through those articles. So if you don't have anything, I had I guess a whole bunch of interesting things. I could read parts of these articles, and if you want, you could comment on that.
Sounds great.
So this is Karl Popper, the nature of philosophical problems and their roots in science. I believe that the function of a scientist or of a philosopher is to solve scientific or philosophical problems rather than to talk about what he or the other philosophers are doing or might do. Even an unsuccessful attempt to solve a scientific or philosophical problem, if it is honest and devoted attempt, appears to be more significant than any discussion of a question as what is science, what is philosophy? And even if we put this latter question, as we should, in the somewhat improved form, what is the character of philosophical problems? I, for one, should not bother much about it. I should feel that it is little weight if compared with even such a minor problem of philosophy as, say, the question whether every discussion must always proceed from assumptions or suppositions which themselves are beyond argument. When describing what is the character of philosophical problems as a somewhat improved form, what is philosophy, I wish to hint at one of the reasons for the futility of the current controversy concerning the nature of philosophy, the naive belief that there is an entity such as philosophy or perhaps philosophical activity, and that it is a certain character of nature. The belief that there is such a thing as physics or biology or archaeology, and that these studies or disciplines are distinguishable by the subject matter which they investigate, appears to me to be a residue from the time when one believed that the theory had to proceed from a definition of its own subject matter. By subject matter or kinds of things or classes of things do not, I hold, constitute a basis for the distinction of disciplines. Disciplines are distinguished partly for historical reasons and reasons of administrative convenience, partially because the theories which we construct to solve our problems have a tendency to grow into unified systems. But all this classification and distinction is comparatively unimportant and superficial affairs. We are not students of subject matter, but students of problems, and problems may cut right across the borders of any subject matter or discipline. And this is a long article, so let me skip a little bit. I'm not sure if you did a comment on that.
Yeah, it's pretty rambly so far. Not really saying much.
Yeah, this Popper, the nature of philosophical problems and the root in science. Ever since the rise of Hegelism, there's existed a dangerous gulf between science and philosophy. Philosophers were accused, rightly, I believe, of philosophizing without knowledge of fact, and their philosophies were described as mere fancies, even imbecile fancies. Although Hegelism was the leading influence of England and on the continent, opposition to it and contempt for its pretentiousness never died out completely. Its downfall was brought about by a philosopher who, like Leibniz, Kant, and Mill before him, had a sound knowledge of science, especially mathematics, speaking of Bertrand Russell. Russell is also the author of the classification, which is the basis of Wittgenstein's view of philosophy, the classifications of the expressions of language into true statements, false statements, and meaningless expressions. Russell operated with this distinction in connection with the solution of the logical paradoxes which he discovered. It was essential for this solution to distinguish more specifically between false statements and meaningless expressions. We might say in ordinary speech that a false statement like 3 times 4 equals 173 or all cats are cows is meaningless. Russell, however, reserved this characterization for expressions such as 3 times 4 are cows or all cats equal 173. That is for expressions which are better not described as false statements but as pseudo statements, meaningless. Russell used this distinction mainly for the elimination of the paradoxes. Wittgenstein went further, led perhaps by the feeling that what philosophers, especially Hegelian philosophers, were saying was somewhat similar to the paradox of logic. He used Russell's distinction in order to denounce all philosophy as meaningless. As a consequence, there could be no genuine philosophical problems. All alleged philosophical problems could be classified into 4 classes: those which are purely logical or mathematical, to be answered by logical or mathematical propositions, and therefore not philosophical; those which are factual, to be answered by some statements of the empirical sciences, and therefore again not philosophical; those which are combinations of the first two, and again not philosophical; and meaningless pseudo problems such as do all cows equal 173, or is Socrates identical, or does an invisible, untouchable, and apparently altogether unknown knowable Socrates exist. So this article goes on, it's 30 pages, but this was, you know, Popper, Wittgenstein's conception of the end of science, the end of philosophy being replaced with science, mathematical logic, and what exactly is the use of philosophy now that we've developed math, logic, and science, so to say. So, this issue that we keep on coming back and forth, questions of what is science, what is philosophy, what do they answer? And if he's saying, well, the purpose is to solve problems, or um, so I thought that was a little bit interesting. I'm not sure. Do you have any comment on that?
I guess I made it in the chat is like the stuff really does start to read like a reassertion of the Aristotelian paradigm
Well, because logic
in
is basically,
perpetuity. Well, it's like
because
if you start with that as your position and then you conclude your presupposition, it's kind of like you're not saying anything. So it's a bit weird that it did appear to be concluding its own presupposition. I don't know if you noticed that, where it said sentences which are true, sentences which are false, and sentences which are meaningless. That's a reassertion of the basic premise that Aristotle had. So, kind of not saying anything. It's just the same unjustified dichotomy as always. It's a bit
Well, no,
like
because
tedious.
Aristotle was more a philosopher than a scientist. So now that you had the advent of science, mathematical science, that would actually be the elimination of philosophy. So just because it's using prepositional logic, um, but as opposed to prepositional logic for philosophy, would be the reduction of philosophy to science. And if it can't be reduced to science,
Actually, it would be the reduction of philosophy to linguistics.
well, maybe that's what you're saying. But I mean, the Popper was talking
Kind
about
of.
Wittgenstein. So I mean, that's why you're hard to comprehend because
I don't agree with.
because you don't
It's because I
clarify
have a
what you're
zero
talking about.
valued
If
logic
you're talking,
instead of a two valued logic.
well, if you opened up, I think. So are you trying to say what Popper? Are you trying to paraphrase what Popper said, what Wittgenstein said, or are you saying I think? And
In which case, am I
usually what
reference
you're
to
saying,
concluding the premise about the
usually what
binary
you're saying is
logic?
I think, but you almost never use the expression I think, and then when we make the statement, um, you're really ungrammatically with the be like the passive voice or um, a verb with no subject. It's unclear what you're talking about because are you saying what Wittgenstein said, what Popper said, what Russell said, or what you said? But you have like this voice of God, like this is the reality, and so you're like I interpret you saying, well, I think this is the case, but you have these subjectless uh, expressions that
All right.
are really not
So
comprehensible.
it would be easier to understand me if I put an extra.
If you
Like,
just
well, you
said
want me
I
to
think,
tell, you want me to Christian
if
a
you're saying
post. You
you're
want me
oh
to
my,
say,
if
and that is my opinion at the end of all my assertions, like Krishna in the Gita.
well, yeah, because it's just, I mean, it's probably like why Week in Review has diminishing educational value. Because saying like if someone wants to walk away, I want to have some clarification. Well, this is what Wittgenstein said, what Russell said, and what Popper said, and
People
then
can find that
if they're your
on, there's
if they're
tons of
your
videos
followers,
on that anywhere. They can look that up. Feel free to look it up. There's tons of stuff already out on that. If you're,
if
that's what
they're
you're
your
interested in.
followers, then they might also want to know what you think.
And if I'm saying it, they can be pretty, rest assured that it's my
Yeah. So
opinion.
basically, everything you say is just what you think. So when Doovid, very little of what I say is what I think. And then if I say like I want to have some sort of clarification for a correct exposition of what Popper, Wittgenstein, and Russell said.
Great. We should do that. And I think that is something you are perfectly capable of contributing to the show.
Okay, let
And
me at least
DeFreak is commenting in the chat. I'm not sure what you mean there, so please rephrase that because I can't understand.
it leads to just confusion and lack of educational value if you're arguing with me or if you just feel like, well, I want to assert what I think, and then even if you're asserting what you think in opposition to who
It's
to
not in
Aristotle
opposition to you, that's for sure. And I'm sorry if
to like
that's what I did.
Wittgenstein to Popper to Russell to Aristotle,
It's really to
or if you say I want to assert what I think,
I just want to assert what I think. It's not relative to any one person, though there obviously are threads that come up and patterns that are really hard to miss once you see them. And one of them is this like binary logic thing. So obviously, I don't blame you for that. It seems like maybe you feel like I'm trying to put you as like the avatar of Western civilization, and you have to defend it on principle. But I'm not categorically opposed to
No,
that
I just want
project.
to accurately state what other people said.
All right. Well, I'm not trying to represent what other people say. I'm trying to represent the ideas and the logic that they purvey, as well as represent how I understand things.
Yeah, so it's unclear. Like if you're just saying what your own assertion, what you think, and so if you're saying what you think in opposition to what someone else
The
said,
opposition, like, what do you mean opposition? I'm here, aren't I? That means it's not an
no, because
opposition.
you most of what you say is generalized, like attacking something else. Is like
Criticism.
you don't usually just say like I think this. You usually say that something else is wrong.
All right. And I'm expecting someone else to say, like, no, it's right because of this reason, but that never happens. So you're saying just my mere communication modality is intrinsically hostile?
Well, it's just basically impossible to follow
All right. Because it
because
doesn't have a textual precedent.
well, I mean, even in your speech, like if you're writing them, because you don't use subjects, so you don't even express, like you don't even say the expression, I think, or if you make it clear, then you make statements that don't have a subject. So sometimes it's unclear because especially when it's in juxtaposition to me, because when I say something, I'm usually talking about a theory of somebody else, and then when you say something subjectlessly,
Okay, so
if
where do
you're
you get your ideas from?
we saying my ideas or
I'm saying,
the,
yeah, where do you
my
get your
conception
ideas?
of other people's ideas.
No,
I mean, I could say, let's say I
I'm
don't have any.
asking where you get your ideas from. And obviously, they have to come from somewhere because you said that what you're stating aren't your opinions, implying you have the opinions which you have opinions which are unstated, which are different from what you're stating, out of a sense of scholarly duty.
What? No, most of these topics I don't have my own ideas or opinions.
All right.
So I mean, I have some ideas or some opinions on some issue. Most of these issues I do not have my own ideas or opinions, and I'm learning the main ideas. And in many of these topics, I'll probably never develop my own ideas or opinions. So my desire is not to even to formulate my own ideas or opinions, let alone assert it, but just to accurately understand canon, the called the quest for truth in general, through uh I'll call like the great the through studying what's been canonized or accepted.
Okay.
That I mean, my general process, and if that goes in opposition to you're saying like you don't that's my method generally, and it said that
That's why I think you're a good uh, co host. Who could do that better than you? I'm obviously terrible at it. Okay,
well,
so like
you're
you're
not even clear
saying I
if you're
got to
saying
preface what I'm saying with in my opinion or I feel that rather than just, interjecting the observation.
um well, sometimes, and just to follow what you're saying, because I mean, if you're I mean, many times it's like it doesn't even make sense what you're saying, and doesn't even, I'm not even sure what you're referring to. And then,
Well, that's good to know.
if I mean, God forbid, that's why I guess Lauren's not here this week. You're putting the comments like, well, I don't know why you get offended with that. Well, if I compare you to
Yeah,
Renault
you mean talking about Lauren Thiel?
Thiel, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, say that I compare you to
They
Renault.
they are here. They just commented like less than 10 minutes ago.
Well, as if when I compared you to Renault, and then I don't even know why that would be offensive to you, but
Because it's obviously a gross oversimplification in a transparent attempt to bolster. It's like basically conveying that you're not willing to cede a single inch in a debate or argument or disagreement, and that sort of doesn't breed goodwill for a lot of people.
when I'm saying the opposite, I mean, one thing, like, he's your guest, like, he's your friend, and you're saying you won't even admit that you agree with him on or that you're similar to him on certain topics. Like, well, why'd you invite him on?
I don't look at things in the sense of agreement because I don't understand knowledge as a set of facts that can either be agreed with or disagreed with. I don't actually think people know what their own beliefs are. That's where I'm coming from as a beginning. So whether we agree, I don't know, because he said two very different things from one appearance to another. So it seems to me like maybe his opinions are still evolving. I have no, it didn't occur to me that we would agree or otherwise. I have no clue. I kind of assume
Well, that there's
very little agreement. What reason would I have to assume agreement with other people based on the amount of disagreement I've had?
when I say obviously, I mean, I'd say there's a lot of agreement, many agreements and similarities between everybody, and then you're certainly between the disagreements between me and you. That in many of these disagreements, you're on the side of Renault, and from what I hold, that,
And you're making it seem like it's
and I don't
two
know why you even take
sides.
that personally. Why wouldn't we say, like, well, of course, like, yeah,
Yeah, and you're
this
saying
issue,
it's two sides, and I'm saying I don't know what you're talking about. What two sides are you talking about?
the traditional approach, the accreditation to sources,
I don't
uh,
feel like I'm
the
against
value of knowledge
anybody. I don't
of
feel like I'm against anybody, okay? Right off the bat. I just don't look at things like that. I think it's not a good habit
but you
to
do,
look at
because you're
things
saying that
that
you
way.
become argumentative. I just said a simple statement like, "Oh, you're similar to Renault like that," and then it was like, "Well, fine, okay, but like, what, some reason like that's upsetting to you, or you call that an insult?" And you're saying, "Well, why are you insulted by that? Like, if you
Well,
obviously are
let's say I
similar."
was like, "Oh, you're similar to Luke Ford,"
Well, yeah, probably similar to Luke Ford, like, in countless ways.
but it was like
Like,
just to win an argument. Don't you think you'd be like, "Oh, well, that's kind of lame to just lump me in with Luke Ford," who obviously I totally disagree with on tons of stuff, just to get
well,
that
if it's
point?
to clarify a
It
point, or
came
saying
across
something that,
as you trying to one up me over a trivial matter, and I just didn't back down. I just that's what I think it ended up at.
we said, like, Doovid's an Orthodox Jew like Luke Ford. Doovid's a streamer like Luke Ford.
I didn't mean
I
it.
mean, so,
I'm
like,
simply
I'm
I'm
not gonna be
citing
like,
it as an example as to why not a good way to frame it, perhaps, and it's
I don't see why
antagonistic.
there's not, no, I don't see any connection why it's not a good way to frame it. I mean, especially in something like this where it's directly pertinent to what we're always talking about. That on these issues, like, and the thing, like, well, he was your guest, he's your guy. Like, why'd you bring him on if, like, if he wasn't similar of your way of looking at things?
So,
You're gonna
there's
insult your
been
own
a
guest.
quite a wide variety of guests on this channel. I've always cherished free speech as a principle. Obviously, not if it's
He's
going
one
to
of,
be
like, the handful of guys.
abused as a principle. Um,
He's one of the handful of people that would say there's, like, someone that
Absolutely
you reached
don't
out
expect to
and
agree with
invited to.
people 100% who come on the show, and I don't know, I don't think you believe that either.
And, so in terms, like, to Doovid, it's important to get these names and ideas and progression of ideas right. And like to Renault, it's not important. And so in that sense, like you're like Renault, you're not like me.
I guess I feel like I am putting
And
it
you're saying
in
like
those
that's an
terms.
insult, like from Doovid, like, no, I don't see you
I
like
feel
me.
like I
I see you like
am
Renault.
doing
That's
that
my
though.
perspective. Like if
You
I was saying like
you
is
say I
Jennifer
always
similar
act
to
like an
me,
Indian
I would
obsessed
say
with
like,
getting the
no,
white
you're
man's
like
approval,
Renault.
and now you're turning around saying I'm fighting convention. You know I care about approval. Okay.
And he's saying like what's
You
something wrong
have
for
to
me to look at it?
acknowledge at some point
You
that
have to take that like
even
an
though it
insult?
seems to you like I'm vehemently disagreeing, from my perspective, it feels like I'm being quite charitable to this position.
Yeah, because that's not your natural position. That's why you have to, because you're like Renault on this. It's why you have to be charitable. Like if you were more like me, you would just be interested in knowing what these people said and getting right to accurately be able to say over what they said or the positions they held. But you're not like me on this. You're like Renault
Most people aren't like you. Most people are like me in that
or like
regard.
Renault.
Like Renault and I in that regard. That the
But you
um
don't give a crap what these people say, let alone want to put a whole
I
bunch of
wouldn't go
work
that far, but that the initial
into
pretext
working
in a
to correctly be able to
conversation
say
doesn't
over.
reduce to correctly citing sources from ancient Greece in a necessarily metaphysically accurate emergence or whatever. Like, obviously, you were disagreeing with his premise. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to engage
I
in
didn't
a.
disagree with his premise. I said that
You
his
didn't have to
premise.
talk to him at all. I could have just talked to him and it didn't escalate with me. It's like, okay, what's the problem? Like, people have opinions. I mean, I've heard wacky opinions of people who believe crazy stuff happened. Aliens in the ancient past. A lot of people have that tier belief. So what's the, I don't know.
Yeah,
I
so from
guess
my
it was
perspective, like
you didn't feel that your identity was properly validated or respected in the exchange, and sure, a person who doesn't like white supremacy is not going to have a lot of love for the position you're imbuing, because that's, I mean, what do you call it, the royal society, a lot of people would say that's a white supremacist type of thing.
well, yeah, I mean, say if I get accused of racism or something like that, like I mean, it's kind of an insult, and take it personal, and because like okay, like um,
I don't recall him
I
being
live in a
called you
majority
racist.
African American. I live in a majority African American area. Deal
He just
the
didn't buy your
majority of
appeal.
people
He
I deal
didn't
with
buy your
are
appeal.
African Americans,
Look, at some point you're
and
going to have to
so
accept that not everyone accepts appeals to academia, either because they don't understand it or they just respect some other authority, theological or philosophical or whatever. It's just how
yeah,
it
or
is.
if they respect themselves as an authority. So
Or that, yeah.
I don't respect myself as an authority. So we say that
Yeah.
if you and Renault are similar, that you both respect yourself as an authority.
I have a limited amount of respect of my localized self as an authority. I don't think it has some sort of supreme
So I don't have any
authority, but
intrinsic self acceptance or
because
respecting myself
I
as an authority.
because I spend so much time, studying, I've been specialized to that adaptation. So yeah, I mean, we could go on forever about this one.
Yes, I mean it's kind of like okay, well, did I learn something? So like, I mean, because I already read these articles, so when I was saying them over, like, oh, obviously, like, you could say what you think about it, but if you, I guess, take like an anti-scholarly approach, or to say I'm not asking you to like argue with these people, or then if it just becomes unclear, like even what you're saying, just
I'm offering commentary,
it's just a
and
communication failure, I guess.
I'm offering a commentary that I don't intend for you to take personally. That's hopefully going to guide science in a better direction. That's where I'm coming from. And you're like, I don't know, a different perspective, so it helps me not get too far off track.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even make sense because okay, like you're trying to guide science,
No,
like
I'm trying to, yeah, in a way, guide science, but also more
I'm just
reform,
trying
like
to learn
philosophy.
something. Try. I mean, like yeah, I could have
That's fine.
grandiose.
Do you know that you and I are different, and that that's all right?
Well, even just say it's like delusions of grandiosity, and say like, nah, I don't. I mean, God forbid, I don't have the delusion of grandiosity that I'm guiding science. I'm just trying to learn something.
Okay.
Like I would be happy just to publish one paper,
To me,
or
guiding
or
science
to
seems
get
like
or to
quite a
get you.
humble endeavor. It seems quite a humble endeavor to guide science, but
Well, I mean, I would be
whatever.
happy just to get this stuff accurate, to be able to say over these ideas accurately. Even
Okay.
the hope of a delusion of grandiosity, like I'm going to guide science. I mean, even if I was like a professor, or maybe even if I had the arbitrary power to accept or reject your paper from being published, and I'm guiding science by rejecting Jennifer from being published or something. I mean, I don't even think that if that existed, like the person's guiding science. That, but I mean, if someone had that sort of power that they could guide science by rejecting papers from being published, or by selecting papers to be published and put forward to the queue, um, maybe that's how people
Guiding
feel.
is just showing people how to think. And well, you first have to convince them that it's worth you showing them how to think. That's the hard part.
Yeah, I just kind of want to understand this stuff and get it right.
Okay.
And I mean, even the
And do you
concept that you
think that you're
can't guide
failing in it?
science,
Do you think that you're succeeding in that endeavor? I think you're doing well.
it's tough to benchmark.
Well, I think you're doing really well. An audience, we literally, it's not realistic to ask the audience this because it's like, hey guys, like based on, what you know about the last 500 years of modern history, like, how good is Doovid's knowledge compared to like everybody else?
It's tough to benchmark, but so let's look at this article, because I wanted to, or let me get these done first, because this is probably directly pertinent to the stuff we're talking about. So here are three sister terms and related on fundamentality, ontological dependence, and metaphysical grounding. And they're kind of all sister terminology. Uh, let's look first on ontological dependence. And this, is the precursor, the philosophical precursor to what science is, how our ideas organized. Now, I'll use the expression often grounding, um, but there's other terminology. So, actually, let's look first at fundamentality. The notion of fundamentality, as it is used in metaphysics, aims to capture the idea that there is something basic or primitive in the world. This metaphysical notion is related to the vernacular use of fundamental, but philosophers have also put forward various technical definitions of the notion. Among the most influential of these is the definition of absolute fundamentality in terms of ontological independence or ungroundedness. Accordingly, the notion of fundamentality is often associated with these two other technical notions covered under ontological dependence and metaphysical grounding. Why Are philosophers interested in fundamentality? One reason comes from a certain view of science. It is not uncommon to think that particle physics has some special role in our inquiry into the structure of reality. After all, every material entity is made up of fundamental particles. So one might think that a particle physics aims to describe the fundamental level of reality, which contains the basic building blocks of natures. We can then employ the notion of relative fundamentality, which enables us to express the hierarchical nature of reality disclosed by science, according to which the facts of biochemistry depend on the facts of elementary chemistry, which depend on the turn of an allegedly fundamental facts of fundamental particle physics. The thought that priority ordering terminates at the fundamental level is often expressed with the notion of well foundedness. The view that reality is well founded in the relevant sense is called metaphysical foundationalism in contrast with metaphysical infinitism. A further opinion which undermines the priority ordering and suggests that dependence chains can form loops is often called metaphysical coherentism. When we identify two key tasks for the notion of fundamentality, the first is to capture the idea that there is a foundation of being which consists of independent entities. The second is to capture the idea that the fundamental entities constitute a complete basis that all else depends on. These tasks are related. In fact, the first would seem to require the second, but not the other way around. When we see that prioritizing one over the other of these tasks may result in different accounts of fundamentality, the second task may be applied to relative fundamentality and used to express the idea that there is a hierarchy of being whereby some entities are more fundamental than others, although strictly speaking, this hierarchical picture is independent of the notion of complete basis. This entry will focus on the contemporary discussion, but many of the ideas debated in this contemporary literature have been found or have been around for a millennium. We now have the tools to make these important ideas much more precise. Relevant historical issues include ancient atomism, Aristotle's many discussions of priority, Aquinas' discussion of first cause, and the principle of sufficient reason as discussed by Spinoza and Leibniz. And as said, here it goes into details the varieties of fundamentality, absolute independence, restricted independence, complete minimal basis, primitivism, um, so these are all long. I'm not sure if it pays to read any more from them. They're related concepts. I'm sure you have any comment on this?
Well, it's very good to have a summary. I'm not sure about a comment. Other than talking about independence, might be incompatible with dependent arising. That always kind of sticks out at me as well. I do have a solution for that though, but anyway, it's whatever. Do you
So
want to keep going
metaphysical,
with the different parts?
yeah. I mean the three sister entry here. So let me just read here briefly. This is still under foundationalism, metaphysical foundationalism. Metaphysical foundationalism, the view that reality has a foundation, that there is a fundamental level in a sense that needs to be specified. The most common way to specify the idea of having a foundation is in terms of well foundedness. But as we have seen in section 2, set theoretical well foundedness may be too strong to capture metaphysical foundationalism. Metaphysical foundation that comes in a variety of strengths depending on how much the well foundedness requirement is weakened. It seems reasonable to say that until quite recently, metaphysical foundationalism was the default position. Sometimes the foundationalist intuition is explicitly tied to composition and the impossibility of the idea that everything has a proper part, the anti gunk worry. So there's also metaphysical infinitism. To endorse metaphysical infinitism is to reject metaphysical foundationalism. But as we've seen, the sense of metaphysical foundationalism defined uh, earlier does not require accepting strong set theoretic well-foundedness, and hence it is compatible with at least some types of infinite descent. Accordingly, metaphysical infinitism is somewhat stronger view than it may at first seem. So this was in relation to like Thomas Aquinas and proofs for God in you foundationalism versus infinite regression. So I usually use the term grounding, but so let's look at this real quick. Consider the
When
following:
you usually use the word grounding when you are talking about what?
a, a coherent worldview that you're,
So the worldview is coherent if it's grounded
yeah,
in
metaphysically grounded.
metaphysically grounded, meaning what? I just feel like we're coming back to the binary logic. I'm just waiting for it. I'm saying that because I noticed a 2 plus 2 equals 4 there.
Well, grounding implies primitives, and so grounded in primitives.
Yep.
And so if you assume that there's such a thing as primitives, and then to be grounded in primitives.
I don't know if everyone agrees that primitive grounding implies primitives, but I agree with that notion because
So
the things in which things are grounded are primitives. This is where my idea about like primitives aren't defined. Primitives define things. They define ranges of things with other primitives. Many primitives. At least there's many that we can resolve as being different.
well, even the fundamentality that there's some things that are more fundamental than others, or hierarchical systems that your fundamentals are hierarchical to derivation, and so primitives are fundamental in that secondary or tertiary or a hierarchical organization of derivation.
You lost me there at the end. I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, so this one's actually pretty difficult. Even reading this, it doesn't really even clearly define these things. So let's just look at
I
the.
think a lot of people that have talked about this do not understand it very well. So there's a it's basically worse than the intuitionistic rationalistic divide in math, or however that's said. It's there's so much intuitive reasoning at play with these metaphysical pros. But anyway, keep going, please.
Yeah, but the importance of most people never get to metaphysics or ontology or epistemology. So there are interesting, difficult questions about grounding its history and what its relationship to the history of philosophy is. On one view, the notion of grounding is old, perhaps as old as philosophy itself, with many of its most important thinkers engaging with questions related to grounding. On another view, the notion of grounding is decidedly new. It's a recent development in contemporary analytical metaphysics. Can we reconcile the grounding is old and grounding is new views? The distinction between questions of grounding and questions about grounding is helpful here. To take one well-worn example, when Socrates asked in the Erythro if someone is pious because they are loved by the gods, or if they are loved by the gods because they are pious, perhaps Plato is directing our attention to the question of grounding. When in the contemporary literature, philosophers are debating about whether grounding is uh, in a strict order, this is the result of their asking questions about grounding historically. So the thinking goes, philosophers have been interested in questions of grounding, whereas the contemporary literature has primarily focused on questions about grounding. This is a sense then in which the notion of grounding is as old as the hills, with the more recent focus in the literature being directed at the notion itself. Although this characterization is appealing, it has limitations. Clearly, contemporary philosophers are interested in questions of grounding in addition to questions about grounding. What might be less clear, however, is that on the face of it, the historical literature is by no means short of attempts at engaging with questions about grounding in addition to questions of grounding. Consider, for example, cosmological arguments. In broad strokes, the thought is that the totality of contingent entities, the cosmos, stands in need of explanation, and only considerations involving God understood as necessary existent are up to the task. Central to such arguments is an assumption according to which we can't explain why there are contingent entities by appealing to the existence of a contingent entity. Debate has raged for centuries over how exactly we ought to understand this assumption and whether or not we ought to believe it. Importantly, the assumption is generally understood as a kind of no circularity assumption. In debating whether the assumption is correct, historical figures are, albeit indirectly, debating whether or not the relation at issue can have reflexive instances. The same goes for discussions around God's nature as a self causer. If the relation at issue is that of grounding, then the history of philosophy is rich in discussions about grounding. Ultimately, however, it seems that the is grounding old or new question should give way to a nuanced and text based discussion of structural similarities and causal continuities between specific thinkers. As this entry will make clear, contemporary figures don't fully agree on the concept of grounding. Hence, it seems that there is little to be gained by asking whether, thus and so, historical figures use the same notion as the contemporary figures aren't using the same notions themselves. Beyond tracing out similarities and differences in context of various notions employed by historical figures and paths of historical development, the question of whether grounding is old or new will apparently always be a crude generalization over these similarities and continuities. And note that there is nothing special about grounding in this regard. The same could be said for virtually any philosophically interesting concept, such as causation or necessity. Okay, so the nature of grounding, according to Plato Stanford Encyclopedia, there are a variety of issues to address related to the nature of grounding. This section we focus on objectivity, representation, hyper intentionality, intentionality, non monotonicity, whether grounding is a strict order, and whether grounding is well founded. There are other interesting issues concerning the nature of grounding that we don't have space to discuss here. One such issue is the metaground. What, if anything, grounds the facts about what grounds what? Objectivity and representation. What are the central features of grounding? Grounding theorists routinely claim that grounding is fully objective, but given that objectivity and related notions are used in a variety of ways in philosophy, it comes as no surprise that there are different ways of understanding precisely what is being claimed here. On one approach, the issue chiefly concerns the regimentation of grounding discourse. If grounding claims are to be formulated with a parameter for facts concerning human mental activity, then grounding isn't fully objective. On a more metaphysical approach, the issue instead chiefly concerns the essence of nature of grounding, specifically whether grounding is essentially connected to subjects. Suppose, for example, the part of what is to be grounded is that P grounds Q only if certain epistemic conditions obtain, actual subjects are in a position to understand certain propositions concerning P, P prime, and Q. In this case, grounding isn't objective. What might speak in favor of objectivism about grounding? Perhaps our considered views about causation should guide our theorizing about grounding. Schaeffer conceives of grounding as being broadly analogous to causation and proposes to extend the familiar structural equation models for causation to grounding. And Wilson argues that grounding is indeed a type of causation, proposing an interventionist account of grounding. So, provided that it's a bad idea to outfit causal claims with a parameter for facts concerning human mental activity, this is probably a bad idea for grounding claims as well. Subjectivism, the claim that while some facts ground other facts, grounding isn't fully objective, however, isn't beyond the pale. One potential route to subjectivism is this: endorse unionism and argue that explanation by its nature subject is by its nature subject involving. Roughly speaking, the representation approach to grounding has it that grounding is intimately tied to representation, while the worldly approach denies this, while the representational worldly distinction is somewhat hazy. We understand it to be orthogonal to the objective subjective distinction. One way to sharpen the distinction between the representational worldly approaches is as follows. On the former, the relation of grounding have concepts among their constituents, or the latter, This isn't the case. So, understood, the representational approach comes in two varieties. Either facts are composed entirely of concepts, or they're a mixture of concepts and non representational items like objects and properties. On the former view, facts are akin to Phrygian propositions. On the latter, they are instead akin to ordered sets of concepts and non representational items. What hinges on whether grounding is representational or worldly? This isn't entirely clear. You might think that grounding being worldly ensures that the relation of grounding, the relata of grounding are relatively coarse grained, and grounding being representational ensures that the relata of grounding are relatively fine grained. Consider the following two facts that liquid is H2O and that liquid is water. Representational, so the thinking goes, might claim that we have distinct facts here as they have different concepts as constituents. And proponents of the worldly approach might claim that we have only one fact here and there's no difference in the constituents or manner of combination. And this, of course, is potentially relevant to theorizing about grounding. If liquid is H2O and liquid is water are the same fact, then the claim that the former grounds the latter or vice versa is false, provided that grounding is irreflexive. Note, however, that representationalists can coherently maintain that facts are relatively coarse grained. Perhaps they think that while facts are Phrygian propositions, concepts are relatively coarse grained, and proponents of the worldly approach can coherently maintain that facts are relatively fine grained. Perhaps they think that while facts are true Russellian propositions, ordered sets of non representational items, including properties, properties are relatively fine grained. You might also think that if grounding is worldly, then unionism is false. The idea that if grounding is worldly, then grounding can't be a type of explanation, as explanation itself is representational. There are, however, conceptions of explanation relative to which explanation is non representational, and a worldly unionist is free to appeal to explanation so conceived. Want me to continue? You have any comment?
Uh, what is this section again? Grounding? It's just the general entry on grounding.
Metaphysical grounding.
Oh, okay.
And they say that even logic has metaphysical presuppositions or prepositional logic that
I've said this before, and sounds like you're agreeing with me. And if that's the case, awesome. It's the first time for everything. Just kidding. Is that what you're saying, though? That you see my point and agree with it? That
um,
there's a,
you know,
like, you need to frame something to get a truth value that may not be something you can justify.
yes, I think in just a technical term, you mean ground, not frame, but maybe you mean frame. But I think technically, I think you mean ground.
Well, I'm saying that grounding is part of a process of making a claim. Framing is more general than grounding. I was just calling attention to the bivalence of it, that there's a fact and then there's something that grounds that fact. And the something that grounds the fact is subject to all the problems, all the, quote, epistemological and whatnot problems that have been pointed out in philosophy over the years. You can't grounding.
Okay, so let's continue. Well foundedness. Another issue is whether grounding is well founded. Different authors mean different things in claiming that grounding is well founded. According to Schaeffer, grounding is well founded in the sense that downwardly non terminating chains of grounds are impossible. If conceiving of grounding as a relation between entities in general and not just facts, Schaeffer's rationale concerns the notion of relative inheritance. Schaeffer claims that were the downwardly non terminating grounding chains, the being of any object in such a chain would be infinitely deferred, never achieved. Something cannot be merely by having a limitless sequence of ancestors, each claiming reality from its parents. Instead, there must actually be a source of reality somewhere. This echoes Leibniz, who claims that in the event that every object is a being of aggregation, one never arrives at any real being. Others claim that grounding is well founded in the sense that any grounded fact is ultimately grounded by ungrounded facts. Note that the conception of the well foundedness of grounding, in contrast to the one above, allows for infinitely descending grounding chains. How so? Foundling Bliss in Rabin and Rappert, considering Euclidean space, which is comprised of points and regions that include those points, suppose that regions are gunky and that every region has a region as a proper part, and suppose that the existent facts concerning regions are grounded by the existent facts concerning their subregions. The existent facts concerning subregions are grounded by the existent facts concerning their subregions, and so on ad infinitum. Hence, the fact that region R exists is a member of an infinitely descending grounding chain. But suppose that the existence facts concerning regions are also grounded by the existing facts concerning points. Suppose, moreover, that the existent facts concerning points lacks ground. Hence, while the fact that R exists is a member of an infinitely descending grounding chain, this fact nonetheless is grounded in facts that themselves lack grounds. The same applies to all the other facts that are links in the grounding chain in question. It may be that if consideration involving reality inheritance are relevant here, they ultimately support the idea that grounding is well founded in the second sense rather than the first. While there may be something wrong about the reality inheritance in the absence of a source of reality, perhaps there's nothing about endless reality inherence per se. And here's also somewhat important: why think there is grounding? Arguments for a theoretical utility. That grounding figures in ordinary philosophical thinking, and that many grounding claims are fairly easy to evaluate, gives us a defeasible reason to think that there is grounding. What else can be said on behalf of grounding? Proponents of grounding tend to think that it's a justified posit on the basis of theoretical utility. In this section, we set out three theoretical utility arguments for grounding that involve utility, explanation, and direction of priority. The unity argument says that grounding is a justified posit because it's unifying role. One way of casting the argument, it has three premises. First, there are substantial unity among the metaphysical relations familiar from metaphysics, such as functional realizations and set formations that resist analysis in purely modal terms. Second, where there is substantial unity, plausibly there is a unifier, something that explains why the relations in question resemble one another in the manner they do. Third, if there is a unifier for the metaphysical relations, the best candidate is grounding. The explanation argument says that grounding is justified posit because of its explanatory role. Recalling the distinction between unionism and separatism, the argument proceeds differently depending on which view is in play. Given separatism, grounding is determination. One way to cast the explanation argument is as follows: there is a form of explanation which we call ontic explanation, such that explanations of this form are backed by worldly relations, and among the ontic explanations are ones that such that the best candidate for the relation that plays the backing role is determination. Given unionism, grounding is explanation. One way to cast the argument is followed: there is a form of explanation, what we call metaphysical explanation, such that the connection in metaphysical explanations are best expressed in terms of explanation. The priority argument says that grounding is justified posit because of its direction fixing role. It fixes the direction of priority between facts, where one fact is prior to another only if the former is more fundamental than the latter. Let a priority case be one in which some fact is prior to another and entities these facts concerned are yoked by metaphysical relations. One way to cast the priority argument is follows: there are priority cases in which the direction of metaphysical relations don't determine which fact is prior to the other, and the best candidate for that which fixes the direction of priority in such cases is grounding. We can cast arguments for grounding in terms of theoretical roles in addition to those specified by unity, explanation, and philosophic priority arguments as well. Some, for example, claim that the thesis of physicalism, roughly the view that the world is ultimately physical in nature, is usefully formulated in terms of grounding. With respect to physicalism about the mental in particular, roughly